Why avoidants can't escape the bond with a super empath even after leaving. Avoidants spend most of their lives mastering one skill better than almost anyone else: hiding. Hiding emotions, hiding fears, hiding needs. They learn early that vulnerability feels dangerous, so they build a version of themselves that appears calm, independent, unaffected, and emotionally untouchable. To the outside world, they can seem confident, detached, logical, or even cold. But underneath that mask is usually someone carrying years of emotional suppression, fear of rejection, fear of dependence, and fear of being truly known. Most people only interact with the surface version of the avoidant. Very few ever reach the deeper layers. But a super empath does. That is exactly why the bond becomes impossible for the avoidant to fully escape. A super empath does not just listen to words. They notice energy, emotional shifts, contradictions, silence, facial expressions, and hidden pain. They can sense when someone is pretending to be okay. And this creates something terrifying for the avoidant: exposure. For the first time, someone has not fallen for the carefully constructed emotional armor. Someone is quietly seeing through it. The avoidant may even feel uncomfortable around the super empath in the beginning because the empath notices things nobody else notices. The avoidant says, "I'm fine," but the empath feels the sadness underneath. The avoidant pulls away emotionally, but the empath senses fear instead of disinterest. The avoidant acts distant, yet the empath can feel the internal conflict behind the behavior. This kind of emotional perception unsettles avoidants because they are used to controlling how much people see. They survive by staying emotionally unreadable. But the super empath changes the entire dynamic without even trying. And what makes it even more powerful is this: the super empath usually sees the avoidant without judgment. Most people react to avoidant behavior with frustration, anger, criticism, or emotional pressure. But the super empath often responds with patience, understanding, and emotional safety. Instead of immediately attacking the avoidant for shutting down, they try to understand the pain behind the withdrawal. Instead of demanding perfection, they create space for honesty. That kind of acceptance becomes deeply addictive to someone who secretly believes they are too emotionally damaged to be fully loved. The avoidant may never say it out loud, but internally they begin experiencing something unfamiliar: relief. Relief that someone finally understands them. Relief that they do not have to constantly explain themselves. Relief that someone notices the parts they spent years hiding. And this is where the emotional bond quietly becomes deeper than either person realizes. Because when someone spends their whole life feeling emotionally misunderstood, being deeply seen creates a psychological impact that does not disappear easily. The avoidant may still run. They may still sabotage the relationship. They may still create distance when intimacy becomes too intense. But even after leaving, they cannot fully erase the memory of how the super empath made them feel. Seen, known, understood. That experience stays with them because it is rare. Avoidants often enter future relationships trying to recreate that same feeling, but something feels missing. They meet people who admire them physically, intellectually, or socially, yet few people connect to the emotional core hidden underneath. The super empath connected to the part nobody else reached, and that becomes unforgettable. The avoidant may pretend the relationship meant nothing. They may act emotionally unaffected after the breakup. Sometimes they convince even themselves that leaving was the correct decision. But internally, many avoidants replay moments from the connection over and over in silence. Certain conversations stay in their mind for years. Certain looks. Certain moments of emotional vulnerability they never shared with anyone else. Because the super empath did something dangerous to the avoidant's emotional world. They made the avoidant feel emotionally visible. And once a person experiences that level of emotional recognition, ordinary connections start feeling shallow by comparison. Surface-level attraction cannot replace emotional depth. Distraction cannot replace genuine understanding. That is why many avoidants keep emotionally circling the memory of the empath long after the relationship ends. Not because they fully understand the bond, but because a part of them knows they may never experience that exact emotional connection again. The painful irony is that avoidants often run most intensely from the people they feel the deepest connection with. The closer they feel emotionally, the more vulnerable they become. And vulnerability activates fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of dependency. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being hurt. After finally opening up, so they leave. But leaving physically does not automatically create emotional freedom. Because the super empath already touched the part of them they spent years protecting from the world. And deep down, the avoidant knows that is not something that happens often in a lifetime. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is the belief that when they leave, they stop caring. On the surface, it can certainly look that way. They go quiet. They stop reaching out. They distract themselves with work, routines, new environments, or even new relationships. Sometimes they appear completely unaffected while the other person is drowning in confusion, trying to understand how someone who once felt so connected can suddenly become emotionally distant overnight. But what most people never realize is that avoidants are masters at suppressing emotion, not escaping it. There is a major difference. An avoidant does not process emotional pain the way emotionally open people do. Instead of confronting feelings directly, they often compartmentalize them. They push emotions into the background and convince themselves they have moved on. The relationship may end physically, but emotionally, the connection often continues operating underneath the surface for a very long time. And when the bond was with a super empath, that emotional attachment becomes even harder to silence. Because the super empath did not simply give attention, affection, or attraction. They created emotional safety. They reached emotional places inside the avoidant that most people never touched. That kind of connection leaves an imprint on the nervous system. Even after separation, the avoidant often continues carrying the emotional presence of the empath in ways they do not fully understand themselves. This is why avoidants frequently replay memories in private while pretending externally that everything is fine. A song suddenly reminds them of the empath. A specific phrase brings back an old conversation. A quiet moment at night triggers memories they thought they buried. A new relationship feels emotionally flat compared to what they experienced before. And the strange part is that many avoidants do not even consciously want to think about the empath anymore. Yet their mind keeps returning to the connection because unresolved emotional attachment does not disappear simply because someone walks away. In fact, avoidants often feel emotions strongest after distance is created. While emotionally expressive people process grief immediately, avoidants delay it. At first, leaving can actually feel relieving to them because space reduces emotional pressure and vulnerability. They finally feel back in control. But over time, once the intensity fades and silence settles in, suppressed emotions begin resurfacing slowly. That is when the emotional bond starts haunting them. Not always dramatically, not always openly, but quietly, internally. The avoidant begins remembering how understood they felt around the super empath. They remember the emotional depth they experienced but struggled to handle at the time. And because avoidants rarely form truly deep attachments easily, those connections become psychologically difficult to replace. This is why some avoidants return months or even years later with unexpected messages, emotional confessions, or sudden curiosity about the empath's life. It is not always manipulation like people assume. Sometimes it is the delayed realization of emotional loss finally catching up to them. Because physical separation never guaranteed emotional detachment. And what makes this even more complicated is that avoidants often fight against their own attachment internally. One side of them misses the connection deeply. Another side fears intimacy, vulnerability, and emotional dependence. So they exist in a painful contradiction. They crave closeness while simultaneously fearing it. That internal conflict creates emotional exhaustion. The avoidant may try to convince themselves that the relationship was too intense, too emotional, or too complicated. But beneath those explanations is often a deeper truth. The connection mattered more than they were emotionally prepared to handle. Super empaths affect avoidance differently because empaths do not connect superficially. They create emotional intimacy that reaches beyond casual attraction. And once an avoidant experiences genuine emotional resonance, it becomes difficult to fully disconnect psychologically. Even when they try to move forward, comparisons happen automatically. New people may be attractive, interesting, available. But the emotional depth feels different. Something feels missing. The avoidant may not admit this openly because acknowledging it forces them to confront grief, regret, and vulnerability. So instead, they suppress, distract, detach, stay busy, pretend. But suppressed attachment has a way of resurfacing in quiet moments. That is why many avoidants seem emotionally calm publicly while privately carrying unresolved emotional tension for years. The bond remains active internally because deep emotional experiences cannot simply be erased through distance alone. And ironically, the super empath often feels this emotional residue too. They sense the connection lingering even after separation. They wonder why they still feel energetically tied to someone who walked away. The answer is that emotionally intense bonds do not always end cleanly, especially when both people touched unresolved emotional wounds inside each other. The avoidant leaves physically because closeness overwhelms them. But emotionally, part of them often stays attached to the person who made them feel understood in a way they rarely experience. And that is the contradiction avoidants struggle with most. The person they run from emotionally is often the very person they cannot fully forget. A super empath does something that most people never realize they are doing. They become an emotional mirror, not through manipulation, pressure, or control, but simply through presence, awareness, and emotional depth. When an avoidant enters a connection with a super empath, they are no longer able to hide from themselves as easily as they once did. The empath reflects back emotions, wounds, fears, contradictions, and unmet needs that the avoidant spent years trying to suppress. And that is one of the biggest reasons the bond becomes so difficult to escape. Most avoidants are comfortable in relationships that stay on the surface. Surface-level conversations feel manageable. Casual attraction feels safe. Emotional distance gives them control. But a super empath naturally pulls people deeper without forcing it. The avoidant starts revealing parts of themselves they normally keep hidden. Sometimes it happens slowly through late-night conversations, emotional honesty, vulnerability, or moments where they unexpectedly feel safe enough to open up. At first, this can feel incredibly comforting to the avoidant. For once, someone understands them beyond appearances. For once, they feel emotionally accepted without needing to perform. For once, they feel connected instead of emotionally isolated. But eventually the connection reaches a dangerous point emotionally. The avoidant begins seeing themselves too clearly through the empath's eyes, and clarity can feel terrifying for someone who built survival around emotional avoidance. The super empath notices patterns the avoidant tries to ignore. They notice when the avoidant withdraws after intimacy. They notice when fear disguises itself as independence. They notice when emotional walls rise after moments of closeness. Without even trying, the empath reflects the avoidant's inner world back to them. That reflection creates discomfort because it removes emotional hiding places. The avoidant may suddenly feel emotionally exposed in ways they cannot explain logically. Around the super empath, they cannot fully maintain the illusion that they are unaffected, invulnerable, or emotionally detached. The empath sees through the mask too consistently. And while part of the avoidant deeply craves that level of understanding, another part feels threatened by it. Because emotional mirrors force people to confront truths they spent years avoiding. The avoidant begins realizing how much fear controls their relationships. How often they push people away before getting hurt. How deeply they fear abandonment despite acting independent. How uncomfortable genuine intimacy actually makes them feel. These realizations do not happen comfortably. They create internal tension. The avoidant may become emotionally inconsistent, confused, distant, or reactive because deep down they are battling themselves. The empath is not causing the wounds. The empath is simply illuminating wounds that already existed. And many avoidants are not emotionally prepared for that level of self-awareness. This is why avoidants often describe emotionally deep relationships as too intense. What they are truly experiencing is emotional reflection. The connection activates unresolved fears they can no longer completely suppress. At times, the avoidant may even project frustration onto the empath. They may accuse the empath of being too emotional, too sensitive, or too demanding, when in reality the empath is simply triggering emotional vulnerability the avoidant struggles to regulate internally. Because when someone spends years disconnecting from their own emotions, being emotionally mirrored feels overwhelming. Yet despite the discomfort, the avoidant becomes deeply attached to the empath's presence. Why? Because the super empath also reflects something else back to them. Possibility. Possibility of emotional safety. Possibility of healing. Possibility of being loved without pretending. Possibility of finally being understood. And that combination becomes psychologically unforgettable. The empath reflects both the avoidance wounds and their hidden emotional needs at the same time. That creates an emotional intensity the avoidant rarely experiences elsewhere. Future relationships may feel easier, calmer, or less emotionally confronting, but they often lack the depth that made the empath connection feel so alive internally. That is why many avoidants continue mentally comparing new partners to the empath long after separation. Nobody mirrors them the same way. Nobody reaches the same emotional depth. Nobody exposes both their fears and their humanity so clearly. And even when the avoidant tries to move on, the emotional mirror remains in their memory. They remember conversations that made them feel understood. Moments where the empath noticed emotions they never verbalized. Times when the empath calmly identified patterns the avoidant secretly knew were true. Those moments stay with them because they felt emotionally real. The painful irony is that avoidants often run from the very mirror they need most. Not because the empath is wrong for them, but because deep emotional reflection threatens the defense systems they spent years building. Distance temporarily helps the avoidant feel emotionally protected again, but the awareness created through the connection does not fully disappear. Once someone has truly seen behind the mask, the avoidant can never completely return to emotional unconsciousness. Part of them now knows what they were hiding from. Part of them now understands why intimacy scares them. Part of them now recognizes the emotional walls they once denied. And that is why the bond lingers even after separation. Because the super empath did not just love the avoidant, they revealed them to themselves. After an avoidant experiences a truly deep connection with a super empath, something changes internally that they rarely talk about openly. On the outside, they may continue dating, socializing, distracting themselves, or acting emotionally unaffected. They may even convince themselves that they have completely moved on. But internally, many avoidants begin noticing a strange emotional emptiness in future relationships that they cannot fully explain. Because once someone experiences genuine emotional depth, surface-level connections no longer satisfy the same way. The super empath offered something rare to the avoidant. Not just affection, not just attraction, not just attention. They offered emotional presence. They created a connection where the avoidant felt psychologically understood, emotionally safe, and deeply seen beneath the mask they normally show the world. And once that experience exists, ordinary relationships often begin feeling emotionally thin in comparison. At first, the avoidant may try to escape this feeling by moving quickly into distractions. Some immerse themselves in work. Some pursue casual relationships. Some seek excitement, novelty, or independence. Others jump into new connections hoping a fresh beginning will remove the emotional weight left behind by the empath. But eventually reality starts surfacing quietly. The conversations do not feel as meaningful. The emotional chemistry feels weaker. The vulnerability feels limited. The emotional safety feels absent. Something feels missing. And the avoidant usually struggles to explain exactly what that something is because avoidants are often disconnected from their deeper emotional language. They only know that the emotional intensity they once experienced with the super empath is difficult to recreate naturally. This happens because super empaths connect beyond personality or attraction alone. They connect to emotional wounds, hidden fears, unspoken needs, and the authentic self underneath emotional defenses. That kind of connection creates emotional imprinting. The avoidant becomes accustomed to a level of emotional depth that casual relationships cannot easily provide. So even if the avoidant enters relationships that appear easier or less emotionally demanding, part of them silently compares those experiences to what they felt before. Not necessarily consciously, but emotionally. A new partner may be beautiful, intelligent, supportive, or exciting, yet the avoidant still feels emotionally restless inside. The connection lacks the same emotional resonance. It lacks the feeling of being deeply understood without explanation. It lacks the emotional intensity that once made. They feel both terrified and alive at the same time. And this creates an internal conflict many avoidants never fully resolve. Because while they often crave peace and emotional distance, they also secretly crave deep connection. The problem is that genuine intimacy activates fear inside them. So they spend much of their life caught between two opposing desires, wanting love deeply, while fearing the vulnerability required to sustain it. The super empath awakened both sides simultaneously. That is why the relationship becomes unforgettable. The avoidant may tell themselves that emotionally lighter relationships are better because they feel safer. Less pressure, less vulnerability, less emotional exposure. But over time, emotional safety without depth can start feeling emotionally numb. And numbness is not fulfillment. This is why many avoidants continue thinking about the empath long after moving on externally. Certain emotional memories continue resurfacing because no replacement fully recreates the psychological experience of being deeply known. The empath challenged them emotionally, understood them emotionally, connected to them emotionally. Future relationships may provide comfort, convenience, attraction, or companionship, but they often fail to reach the same emotional core. And the avoidant notices this more than people realize. Sometimes they notice it late at night when life becomes quiet. Sometimes during emotionally empty conversations. Sometimes while lying beside someone who feels emotionally distant despite physical closeness. Sometimes when nobody notices their hidden emotional struggles the way the empath once did effortlessly. That absence becomes impossible to ignore forever. The avoidant may even become frustrated with themselves because they cannot stop comparing. They may feel guilty for emotionally revisiting a past connection, while trying to move forward. But emotional depth leaves traces on the mind and nervous system. People do not easily forget the rare individuals who made them feel emotionally alive beneath years of suppression. And the painful truth is that avoidants often realize the value of deep emotional connection fully only after losing it. When the empath was present, intimacy felt overwhelming. After the empath leaves, emotional emptiness becomes overwhelming. That is the contradiction. The avoidant begins understanding that what once scared them was also the very thing that made the connection meaningful. The emotional intensity they tried to escape was actually proof of genuine attachment. But by the time this realization fully develops, the super empath is often no longer emotionally available in the same way. Because super empaths eventually grow tired of carrying one-sided emotional depth. They heal, they detach, they redirect their energy toward themselves. And once that happens, the avoidant finally experiences the full emotional weight of what was lost. Not just a person, but a level of emotional connection they may spend years trying to find again. And that is why no surface-level relationship ever fully feels the same afterward. One of the most confusing parts of loving an avoidant is this strange pattern that keeps repeating itself. The more you chase them, the more distant they become. The more emotional pressure they feel, the more they withdraw. The more you beg for reassurance, closeness, or consistency, the more trapped they start feeling internally. To someone who loves deeply, this behavior feels cruel and irrational. But for the avoidant nervous system, emotional pursuit often activates fear instead of comfort. That is why many avoidants do not fully feel the loss of the super empath while the empath is still chasing them. As long as the empath remains emotionally available, constantly reaching out, trying to fix the relationship, over-explaining feelings, or waiting for emotional crumbs, the avoidant unconsciously feels control over the connection. Deep down, they believe the bond is still accessible whenever they are emotionally ready. Even if they pull away physically or emotionally, part of them assumes the empath will still be there, and that assumption delays emotional consequences. But everything changes the moment the super empath truly detaches. Not through manipulation, not through silent games, not through fake indifference, but through genuine emotional withdrawal and self-respect. This is the moment many avoidants suddenly begin feeling the reality of the loss in a way they never did before, because the emotional energy that once surrounded them disappears. The constant reassurance disappears. The emotional availability disappears. The understanding they once took for granted disappears. And the silence becomes emotionally loud. For the first time, the avoidant senses something they spent most of the relationship avoiding: permanence. The empath is no longer emotionally waiting, no longer trying to force connection, longer abandoning themselves to maintain the bond. The emotional door that once felt permanently open begins closing quietly. That shift creates panic internally for many avoidants, even if they never show it openly. Because avoidants often process attachment through absence. When closeness exists constantly, they feel overwhelmed. When closeness disappears completely, they finally feel the attachment underneath their defenses. This is why avoidants frequently return only after the empath stops chasing. Not because the avoidant suddenly changed overnight, not because the relationship magically became easy, but because emotional distance removes the pressure that once activated fear, while simultaneously forcing the avoidant to confront the emotional void left behind. And that void becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly the avoidant starts replaying memories more intensely. They begin wondering what the empath is doing, who they are talking to, whether they have moved on emotionally, whether the connection is truly over. The same avoidant who once seemed emotionally detached may now feel consumed by uncertainty internally because the emotional security they unconsciously relied on is gone. And the super empath usually does not realize how powerful this shift is. The moment the empath stops overfunctioning emotionally, the balance changes completely. The avoidant no longer feels emotionally chased. Instead, they feel emotionally disconnected from the one person who understood them most deeply. That realization hits hard, because avoidants often assume people will eventually abandon them emotionally anyway. Many carry unconscious beliefs that deep love never lasts, that vulnerability leads to pain, or that closeness eventually becomes unsafe. So when the empath keeps chasing despite emotional inconsistency, the avoidant unconsciously expects the cycle to continue forever. But when the empath finally chooses themselves, heals, grows, and emotionally detaches, the avoidant is forced to face something unfamiliar. Consequences, not punishment. Consequences. The loss of emotional access. The loss of emotional safety. The loss of someone who genuinely understood them beneath the mask. And this is usually when delayed emotions surface most intensely. The avoidant may suddenly reach out with unexpected messages, small check-ins, indirect curiosity, emotional breadcrumbs, nostalgia, or even vulnerable confessions they could not express earlier. To outsiders, this behavior looks confusing because it seems backwards. Why show emotion only after the other person lets go? Because avoidants often need emotional space to finally feel what closeness prevented them from processing. When intimacy feels overwhelming, they disconnect from emotion to survive psychologically. But when the connection truly fades, suppressed attachment rises to the surface, and the avoided begins realizing something painful. The super empath was not weak for loving deeply. The empath was actually the emotional anchor holding the connection together. Once that anchor disappears, the avoidant feels emotionally untethered. This is also why many avoidants become unexpectedly obsessed with the empath's transformation after separation. When the empath stops chasing and starts rebuilding their life, the avoidant witnesses something they never expected: emotional independence. The person they assumed would always remain emotionally attached is now choosing themselves fully. That changes how the avoidant sees them. The empath becomes even more emotionally valuable in absence because the avoidant can now feel the true depth of the bond without the emotional pressure that once triggered fear. And ironically, by the time the avoidant becomes emotionally ready to acknowledge the connection fully, the super empath has often outgrown the version of themselves that once begged for love. Because healing changed them too. Now the avoidant is left carrying the emotional realization they tried so hard to escape in the beginning. The person they kept running from was the person who loved them most genuinely. Some connections enter your life quietly and leave without changing much. But the connection between an avoidant and a super empath is rarely one of those relationships. It is the kind of bond that reaches into hidden emotional spaces, exposes old wounds, activates deep fears, and changes both people in ways they do not fully understand until much later. Even if the relationship ends, even if years pass without contact, neither person walks away as the same version of themselves that existed before the connection began. Because relationships like this are not casual emotional experiences. They are emotional awakenings. The avoidant enters the relationship believing emotional distance protects them. They rely on control, independence, detachment, and emotional suppression to survive psychologically. Most of their life has been built around avoiding vulnerability because vulnerability feels unsafe. They learn to minimize needs, hide pain, and disconnect before anyone gets close enough to hurt them deeply. Then the super empath arrives. And suddenly the avoidant experiences something unfamiliar: emotional visibility. For the first time, someone sees beyond the mask without immediately rejecting them. Someone notices the fear hidden beneath the distance. Someone responds to emotional withdrawal with understanding instead of instant abandonment. The empath creates emotional intimacy that slowly weakens the avoidant's defense systems. And that changes the avoidant permanently. Even if they run from the relationship later, they can never completely erase the awareness the empath created inside them. They now understand that their emotional walls exist for a reason. They become more conscious of their fear of closeness. They start recognizing patterns they once denied completely. They realize how often they sabotage connection. When emotions become real, the relationship forces the avoidant to confront themselves emotionally. And once that awareness exists, it cannot fully disappear. At the same time, the super empath changes too. Before the relationship, the empath may have believed that enough love, patience, sacrifice, or understanding could heal another person completely. They may have entered the connection believing emotional depth alone could overcome fear and emotional unavailability. Like many deeply empathetic people, they often ignore their own emotional exhaustion while focusing entirely on the other person's wounds. But loving an avoidant teaches painful lessons. The empath learns that understanding someone's pain does not automatically make them capable of healthy love. They learn that emotional connection cannot survive through one-sided effort forever. They learn that self-abandonment is not unconditional love. And most importantly, they learn that they cannot force another person to heal before that person is emotionally ready. Those lessons transform the empath permanently. After enough emotional pain, the super empath begins reclaiming themselves. They start recognizing the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. They begin setting boundaries. They stop over-explaining their worth. They stop chasing emotional validation from emotionally unavailable people. The relationship becomes a catalyst for growth on both sides. Painful growth, but growth nonetheless. That is why these connections remain emotionally unforgettable even when they end. Both people touched unresolved emotional wounds inside each other that had existed long before the relationship started. The avoidant's fear of intimacy collided with the empath's fear of abandonment. One person ran from closeness while the other tried desperately to preserve it. And somewhere inside that painful dynamic, both people were forced to confront parts of themselves they had ignored for years. The avoidant confronted vulnerability. The empath confronted self-worth. The avoidant confronted emotional suppression. The empath confronted emotional overgiving. The avoidant confronted fear of intimacy. The empath confronted fear of losing connection. These are life-changing realizations. That is why many avoidants quietly carry emotional regret long after separation. Not always because they wanted the relationship to end, but because they realize how rare genuine emotional connection actually was. And once they encounter emotionally shallow relationships afterward, the memory of the empath often becomes even stronger. At the same time, the super empath often carries emotional scars from the relationship too. They may struggle for a while with confusion, grief, emotional exhaustion, or questions about why love alone was not enough. But eventually, many empaths emerge stronger, wiser, and more emotionally balanced than before. The relationship breaks illusions on both sides. And broken illusions create transformation. The painful truth is that sometimes two people genuinely love each other but still lack the emotional readiness to sustain the connection in a healthy way. Love alone does not erase attachment wounds, trauma responses, emotional fear, or years of psychological conditioning. But even when the relationship fails externally, the emotional impact remains. The avoidant never fully forgets the person who saw behind the mask. The empath never fully forgets the person who taught them the importance of protecting their own heart too. And that is why the bond changes both people forever. Not because they were destined to stay together forever, but because they forced each other to evolve emotionally in ways ordinary relationships never could.